The sound cut through the room before I even understood what had happened. A crack so loud it silenced the string trio mid-phrase, and 40-odd guests turned at once toward the sound of my own face being struck. My hand went up to my cheek, slow, disbelieving, and Margaret Sutcliffe drew her arm back and did it again. That was the night I called my mother. That was the night I understood exactly what kind of family I'd almost married into. But to explain why a 61-year-old woman in a cream wool coat slapped her son's fiancée twice in the middle of a private dining room at the Albany Club, you need to understand the 8 months that came before it. You need to understand who I was before I became the woman standing there with a handprint blooming on her face, blinking back tears in front of people already reaching for their phones. My name is Elena Castellano. I'm 34. I'm a structural engineer, partner at a mid-sized firm here in Toronto that does seismic retrofits and heritage building restoration. Not glamorous work, but steady and mine. I'd built it the slow way, the way most women in this industry have to. Nights spent rechecking load calculations long after everyone else had gone home, a decade of being the only woman in the room at site meetings, learning to let silence do the talking when a contractor twice my age tried to explain my own drawings back to me. I'd been with Owen Sutcliffe for 2.5 years. We met at a fundraiser for the Center for Urban Growth, both of us roped into the same silent auction table by friends who thought we'd get along. He was a corporate lawyer, 39, divorced, no kids, the kind of calm that I mistook, for a long time, for steadiness rather than avoidance. We took things slow. I met his father within the first few months. Gerald was a retired pediatrician, soft-spoken, easy. I didn't meet his mother until almost a year in. That gap should have told me something. It always does, in hindsight. My life before all this was genuinely good. Not loud good, not Instagram good, just solidly, quietly good, in the way you build for yourself when nobody's handed you anything. I'd come up through a large downtown firm doing the unglamorous grunt work that made senior partners' names look brilliant. And then at 29, I'd left to start something of my own with a colleague named Marcus Whitlow. We'd been junior engineers together, trusted each other, complimented each other. He was the one who could charm a room full of developers into signing. I was the one who stayed until midnight, making sure the numbers actually held up a building. Castellano Whitlow Structural had 11 employees by the time all this happened, a decent reputation across the GTA, and a project pipeline that gave me, for the first time in my adult life, real financial footing. I owned my condo in Leslieville outright except for a manageable mortgage at a rate I'd locked in before everything got stupid. I had a cat named Rivet, an enormous orange tabby I'd adopted from a shelter in Scarborough 4 years earlier, who greeted Owen every time he came over with the specific contempt of an animal who had not been consulted. I want you to picture an ordinary Thursday morning in early autumn, because it's the morning everything started, even though I didn't know it yet. Rivet is parked on the windowsill doing his surveillance routine. I've got coffee in one hand and a tablet propped against the fruit bowl, reviewing retrofit drawings for a building on Spadina. Owen's at the counter in his undershirt, scrolling his phone, and the light coming through the window has that early fall amber to it, the kind that makes even a Tuesday feel like it matters. He looks up and says, "Mom wants us over for dinner Sunday." I say, "This Sunday?" "This Sunday." I remember setting my mug down carefully, the way you do when you're buying yourself a second to think. I'd met Margaret Sutcliffe exactly twice by then, both times brief and performative. A holiday open house, a gallery opening Owen had dragged me to. Both times she'd asked, within minutes of being introduced, some version of what I did for a living and how that was working out financially. The first time she'd done it so smoothly, I almost didn't clock it as an interrogation. I'd driven home turning it over anyway. "Is this a thing?" I asked Owen. "Like a regular Sunday dinner thing, or a specific thing?" He gave me that half smile he did when he was being evasive without technically lying. "She wants to get to know you better. We've been together 2.5 years. I think she feels it's time." I said, "Sure, of course." I told myself difficult, future mothers-in-law were a universal tax everyone eventually paid, and that I was a competent adult who'd navigated harder personalities than one wealthy Rosedale woman with opinions about her son's choices. What I didn't know, what Owen had conveniently failed to mention, was that he was planning to propose at that dinner. He did it over dessert, in front of Margaret and his father Gerald, down on one knee beside the dining table in that immaculate house on Crescent Road, and he said the things people say, and I said yes, and I meant every bit of it. I was 34. I'd been careful and deliberate about this relationship in a way I hadn't been about any before it. I loved him. Margaret hugged me. She said, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart," in a voice warm enough that I let myself believe it. I thought that was a beginning. It was actually an audition, and I'd just been told I'd made the callback. The shift was subtle at first. A comment at Thanksgiving. Yes, we did Thanksgiving with the Sutcliffes, which in retrospect was its own quiet flex, about how she'd always pictured Owen's wedding at the same Muskoka lodge her college roommate's daughter had used. Not aggressive. Just a stone dropped into still water, watched for the ripple. I smiled and said Owen and I hadn't really talked venues yet. She said, of course, and moved smoothly on. Then there was the Boxing Day thing, where she mentioned to Owen's cousin, in a tone calibrated for maximum condescension, that I did something with buildings. His cousin looked at me with that specific suburban pity. "Oh, you have a job. How brave." And Owen changed the subject instead of correcting her. I brought it up in the car. She made it sound like I draw blueprints in a basement for cash. Owen said, "She doesn't really get what structural engineers do. She didn't mean anything by it." I said, "She asked me my firm's revenue the first time we met, Owen. She understands exactly what she's asking." He went quiet. That was a thing about Owen. He went quiet when he didn't want to agree with you, but couldn't find the nerve to disagree either. I used to read that as thoughtfulness. I was starting to recalibrate. By the time February hit, the specific gray, bone-deep cold of a Toronto February that makes you question every life decision you've ever made. Margaret had suggested twice, slightly, that maybe I was a bit too career-driven to give her son the home life he deserved. She'd mentioned, with that same unreachable smile, that his ex-wife had been very devoted to creating a proper household. And at a dinner where I was the only person at the table who'd actually finished the beet salad, she'd asked whether my father was still working or retired. I'd answered evenly. "Semi-retired," I said, which was technically true. What I left out, because it wasn't her business and because I refused to lead with it, was the rest. My father, Antonio Castellano, had spent 30 years building a commercial construction and property management company out of Hamilton, starting with one used cement mixer and a loan he'd had to get his own father to co-sign. By the time I was telling this story, he managed properties and active builds worth somewhere north of $35 million across southern Ontario. He still drove a beat-up Ford pickup, still knew his foreman's kids' names, still wore the same brand of steel-toed boots he'd worn for 2 decades. He was the best person I knew. Margaret had no idea any of this existed, and I'd made the deliberate choice not to tell her, because it felt like a test I refused to take on her terms. The engagement party was her idea, of course. The 3rd Saturday in February at the Albany Club, a private dining room she'd booked herself with a guest list of 55 people, most of whom I'd never met in my life. She chose the caterer, she chose the florist. When I gently suggested Owen and I might want some say in who got invited, she looked at me with such serene, bottomless confidence that I felt like a child asking to rearrange furniture in someone else's house. I should have known, standing in that frozen parking lot in my black dress, watching my heels sink slightly into the slush while Owen held the door, that I was walking into something I wasn't braced for. The first hour was fine. Champagne, introductions, the particular fatigue of being the woman everyone wants to size up without appearing to size up. I smiled until my jaw ached. I talked about the firm. I talked about the house Owen and I were hoping to buy in the Beaches, a house I had, more than a little absurdly, already sketched preliminary layouts for in my notebook, because that's what engineers do. We can't help it. I talked to Gerald, who was genuinely warm in his quiet way, and to Owen's younger sister, Vanessa, who seemed almost apologetic about the whole evening in a way I couldn't quite read at the time. Then Margaret pulled me aside. She steered me by the elbow toward the corridor near the coat check, away from the main room, her grip firmer than I expected. She smelled like Chanel No. 5, and I remember thinking that felt appropriate. "I want to talk to you about something before this goes any further," she said. "Of course," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. "I've been looking into your firm." A pause. "Into you." My stomach dropped a good 3 inches, not because I had anything to hide, because of how she said it, deliberate, rehearsed, like she'd already decided what she'd found. "Marcus Whitlow called me," she said, and there it was. The room tilted, just slightly. Marcus. My business partner, the man I'd built Castellano Whitlow with over 7 years, who had keys to the office and access to every account we held, who knew every client relationship we had. Marcus had called Owen's mother. "He told me some very concerning things about the state of your firm's finances," Margaret said, her voice pleasant the way a scalpel is pleasant. "And some decisions you've apparently been making without his knowledge." "He's quite worried." "Marcus called you," I repeated. "He's worried about his investment," she said. "And frankly, so am I. My son is about to merge his life with yours. I have every right to know what I'm looking at." I felt that cold, narrowing clarity that comes right before anger turns into something colder and more useful. "Whatever Marcus told you, I'd like to hear it from him directly," I said, "because I'm not aware of any irregularities in our firm's finances." Margaret looked at me for a long beat, then said, still smiling, "He told me you've been redirecting client retainers, that there are accounts he can't access, that you've been quietly building something on the side without telling him." The accusation landed like a slap of its own, because it was a lie, fully constructed, and because some instinctive part of me already understood exactly why Marcus would have told it. I didn't get the chance to respond because that was the moment Owen walked over with 2 glasses of champagne and a look on his face that told me, in the specific way you can read someone you've loved for 2.5 years, that he'd caught the tail end of what his mother had just said. Margaret glanced at her son, then back at me, and said, loud enough that the 2 couples nearest us turned, "I will not let some opportunist drag my son down into whatever mess she's made of her business." And then she slapped me. The room went quiet in stages, like a ripple moving outward from where a stone hits water. I stood there with my hand half raised toward my burning cheek, my mind doing the thing it does in shock, hunting for a logical explanation that didn't exist. She did it again. Harder. Owen said, "Mom," in a voice too small, too late, too uncertain to mean anything. I lowered my hand. I looked at Margaret Sutcliffe's face, flushed, certain, utterly convinced she had the right. And I made a decision that felt like the clearest thing I'd felt in months. I walked to the coat check. I took my coat. I walked out the front doors into a cold so sharp it felt almost clarifying, stood on the salted steps of the Albany Club, and called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. She always does. "Mom," I said, "I need you to come get me. And I need you to bring Dad. And I need both of you to deal with this without any mercy at all." There was a pause, not a long one, maybe 2 seconds. Then my mother said, "Where exactly are you?" "King Street." "The Albany Club. Your father and I are 25 minutes out," she said. "Go back inside somewhere warm. Don't talk to anyone." She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask me to explain first. That's my mother, Diane Castellano, in a single exchange. She assesses, she tells you what's about to happen, and then it happens. I'd watched her and my father operate like that my entire life. I had never been more grateful for it than I was standing on those icy steps with my face still stinging. I went back inside, but not into the main room. I found a small empty seating nook near the coat check and sat down, and instead of falling apart, I did exactly what I should have done the second Marcus's name left Margaret's mouth. I called my lawyer. Her name is Priya Nakamura. She's been my firm's business attorney since the day Marcus and I incorporated, and she has the specific gift of picking up her phone at 9:40 on a Saturday night without sounding even slightly inconvenienced. I told her everything in about 4 minutes. She said, "Elena, listen to me. Log into the firm's accounting portal right now, from your phone, and screenshot every account balance, every transaction from the last 90 days, every retainer received and disbursed. Do it before he can touch anything else. You think he'd actually move money tonight? I think a man who called your fiancé's mother with a fabricated story about your finances has already decided to do something," she said. "I don't know what yet. Document everything right now. Before Monday morning." I spent the next half hour in that chair doing exactly that, hands steadier than I expected. The shock had burned off and left something colder and more focused underneath, the kind of focus you get once you understand you're in a fight and there's no use being sentimental about it. Here's what I found in those 30 minutes, and what I found confirmed exactly what I'd already started to suspect. Marcus was the one moving money, not me. We had 3 client retainer accounts requiring dual authorization for any withdrawal, and on 2 of them, the authorization log showed Marcus had added a secondary signer 3 weeks earlier. A name I didn't recognize. He'd been quietly building the infrastructure to drain those accounts and pin the irregularities on me. The story he fed Margaret wasn't some jealous invention. It was a script. The cover story for what he was already doing. I sent Priya all 40-some screenshots. She texted back 3 minutes later, "You're going to be fine. Don't say a word to anyone at that party about this. Your parents on the way?" "Yes," I typed. "Good." I heard the shift in the main room before I saw it. The quartet had stopped. Voices had dropped into that lower, deliberate register a room gets when everyone's pretending not to watch something. I stood and looked around the corner. My parents had arrived in 23 minutes. I don't know how, given the slush on the gardener, but my mother has always had a particular relationship with urgency when it matters. She was standing just inside the entrance in her good camel coat. My father beside her in a parka he'd clearly thrown on over a flannel shirt, work boots still salt-stained from the site he'd come from. He looked completely out of place among the cocktail dresses, 63 years old, lean, weathered from 3 decades of being outside on job sites in every kind of weather Ontario could produce. He also had 2 people with him. One was Priya herself. She'd driven down, in jeans, hair still damp. The other was a compact man in his 50s, I recognized from my father's office Christmas parties. Harold Fenimore, who'd run the relationship between my father's company and one of the big 5 banks for going on 15 years. He was in a sport coat thrown over a hoodie. He'd come straight from his own Saturday night. Margaret was already moving toward them, before they'd fully crossed the room, her posture suggesting she'd decided these were uninvited guests to be managed. "I'm sorry," she said, in her most controlled hostess voice. "This is a private event." My father looked at her without much expression at all. "You're Margaret Sutcliffe," he said. She stopped moving. Something in his tone, not hostile, just very precise, made her stop. "Antonio Castellano," he said. "Elena's father." A pause. "I think you and I have some things to discuss." I walked into the room then. I watched Owen see me, watched him register my father, Priya, and Harold all at once, watched something complicated shift behind his eyes. Vanessa was standing near the fireplace and she looked almost relieved, which I filed away for later. Owen came toward me, said quietly, "Elena, I'm so sorry. What she said, what she did, I should have." "Not right now," I said, without any cruelty in it. "I just didn't have the bandwidth." My father, my mother, Priya, and Margaret moved toward the windows at the far end of the room. Gerald had materialized beside his wife the way he always did, present and quiet and slightly behind her. I moved to stand next to my father. Margaret looked at the four of us and visibly recalibrated. "I don't know what Elena has told you," she said, "but I was simply protecting my son's interests." Priya said, "Mrs. Sutcliffe, I'm going to stop you there." She opened a folder she'd had under her arm and laid 4 pages on the nearest cocktail table with the precise care of someone who'd done this many times before. "These are preliminary findings from a forensic review of Castellano Whitlow's financials initiated about 40 minutes ago. They show a pattern of unauthorized account access and fund movement consistent with embezzlement, traceable to your son's friend Marcus Whitlow, not to Elena." The room had gone properly quiet now. Not silent. Glasses still clinked somewhere, but the 20 or so people closest to us had stopped pretending they weren't watching. "That's not what." Margaret started. "Marcus Whitlow called you with a fabricated story," my father said. His voice was almost gentle, which made it worse. "He is right now in the process of stealing from your son's fiancé's business. He told you a lie to build himself a cover story, and you decided to use it as a weapon." He held her. "You hit my daughter, twice, in front of 55 people." Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. Harold said, from slightly behind my father, "Antonio, I can confirm the account flags. We caught anomalous access on 2 of the joint accounts Thursday morning. We were going to call Elena Monday. But," he glanced at me, "given tonight, that timeline's moved up." I looked directly at Margaret. "I want you to hear this clearly," I said. "You called me an opportunist in front of everyone in this room. You called my business a mess. You put your hands on me twice." I kept my voice level. I'd been practicing that particular skill since I was 22, and I wasn't going to lose it now. My firm's revenue last year was just over $2.1 million. I own my home outright in 3 years. My credit score is 812. I paused, and my father built a $35 million company out of 1 cement mixer and a loan his own father co-signed. You asked if he was still working. He's not retired. He just doesn't feel the need to announce it at dinner parties. Something crossed Margaret's face. Not remorse, exactly. I don't think Margaret Sutcliffe has remorse in the conventional sense available to her. It was closer to recalculation. The realization that she'd attacked someone without confirming the terrain first, which was, in her world, the unforgivable error. Gerald put a hand on his wife's arm. "Margaret," he said. "Just that," Priya said quietly. "Elena won't be filing an assault complaint tonight, provided this evening ends here, and provided you make no further contact with her, her firm, or her staff." She said it like a fact, not a threat. "If that condition isn't met, we're having a very different conversation, and it'll happen with Toronto Police Service, not in this room." Owen, standing behind me, said, "Mom, you need to apologize." Margaret looked at her son, then at me. The certainty in her face hadn't fully collapsed. People like Margaret rarely fully collapse, they just reorganize, but it had cracked in the exact place she'd believed was untouchable. Elena, a breath, I acted on information that I now understand may have been. May have been, I said. Okay. I turned to Owen. His face was just doing some complicated guilt, grief, the early shape of a reckoning with who his mother actually was, and what it meant that she'd done this in front of everyone he knew. I'd loved that face for 2.5 years. I knew every register of it. I need you to answer one thing, I said, not her. You. Did you believe any of it? He didn't answer right away. That pause, that small, specific silence, told me everything about what the next 6 months would look like if I stayed. Okay, I said. I kissed him on the cheek, and I meant it. Then I picked my coat up off the chair where I'd left it, and I walked out with my parents and Priya and Harold into the cold that had turned to freezing rain, and I didn't look back. The drive home with my parents was quiet for the first while, my mother's hand resting on the back of my father's seat, my father driving the way he always drives, unhurried, both hands on the wheel. The rain ticked steadily against the windshield. Finally, my mother said, "You doing okay?" "I will be," I said. "Marcus," my father said. "Yeah," I said. "Priya's filing for an injunction Monday morning. Freezing the joint accounts. You'll have the full forensic report inside a week." He glanced at me in the rear view. "You want criminal charges, or do you want to keep it civil?" I thought about 7 years of building something with someone I'd trusted completely. I thought about the keys he had to our office, the access he had to every client relationship we'd built, the calculated way he'd decided to burn it all down and hand the match to my future mother-in-law to light. "Both," I said. My father nodded once. That was that. The legal process took close to 5 months, and none of it was pleasant. Marcus had moved faster than we'd caught. He'd already wired just over $94,000 from one retainer account into a numbered company registered to his girlfriend. Priya's forensic accountant traced it within 10 days. We filed both the civil suit and a criminal complaint with the Toronto Police Financial Crimes Unit. He settled the civil case 7 weeks later for full restitution plus damages, which came out to just over $140,000. Once interest and legal fees were tallied. The criminal matter resolved through a plea, 18 months probation, community service, and a permanent professional bar from holding any fiduciary role at a licensed engineering firm in Ontario. Castellano Whitlow Structural became Castellano Engineering Group that spring. I bought out Marcus's equity as part of the settlement. I made our senior project manager, a woman named Fatima Boaheen, who'd been with us 5 years and was honestly better at half of Marcus's job than he'd ever been, into an equity partner. We hired 2 junior engineers that summer. The firm is intact. Better, actually. Cleaner. Owen and I ended the engagement 9 days after the party. It wasn't a dramatic conversation. We sat in his apartment off Bloor and talked for alphos, and what came out of it was honest and sad and necessary. He loved his mother in the way people love someone who's made their world both smaller and safer their whole life, and he wasn't ready to stop doing that. Maybe he would be, eventually. I genuinely hoped so, for his sake. But I was 34 years old, and I'd worked too hard and built too much to spend years waiting on a man to decide whether his mother's version of me or the actual me was the one he was willing to defend. I kept the ring for about a week before I gave it back. It was a beautiful ring. I just didn't want to look at it anymore. Margaret Sutcliffe never apologized, not really, not in any way that reached the bone. She sent a note through her own lawyer, 3 lines, careful and bloodless, expressing regret for any distress caused. I read it once, filed it, and haven't thought about it since. Vanessa called me in March. "I want you to know I told him she'd do something like this," she said. "Before he even proposed, I told him." A pause. I'm sorry he didn't listen. Thank you for saying that, I told her. It mattered more than I expected it to. My father, for his part, never once said I told you so, because that's not who Antonio Castellano is. What he did was show up at my condo the next Saturday with a bag of Rivet's favorite treats and a tray of lasagna my mother had made. And he sat at my kitchen counter and drank coffee while I talked. And he listened the way he always has. Completely, without an agenda, without trying to fix what didn't need fixing. At some point I said, I really thought I had this one figured out. He said, You did figure it out, just faster than you thought you would.